abstinence, chastity, marital fidelity, and exclusive heterosexuality. They gave us this. A 300-page catalog, which I can summarize statistically as follows in here. We did 2 months of research to unearth this. There's a total of 110 examples in the book of their sexual behavior, misbehavior. And here's a breakdown. There's 22 examples of adultery, 10 of transactions with prostitutes, 3 of occurrences of incest, 4 of acts of indecent exposure, unwelcome advances resulting in 6 reports of sexual assault and 4 of sexual battery, 15 cases of child molestation, 13 of involvement with child pornography, 7 of soliciting sex with a minor, 3 of those specifically concerning 5-year-old children, 3 5-year-old children, and 1 concerning a 3-year-old. Grand total, as I said, is 110. Out of that 110, 46, nearly 42%, involve pedophilia behavior. This conduct involves 32 federally elected Republican officials or candidates for federal office, 41 state and locally elected Republican officials, 8 nationally known Republican Party officials, and 23 Republican or conservative activists. And the most astounding number in there, and the one that shocked us when we got the research in, is the number of pedophiles involved. When Republicans come to my readings, I don't know if they're doing that, they say, well, what about Clinton? What about John Edwards? Don't all Democrats do this too? Well, in this book, there's only 22 examples of adultery, but there's 46 of pedophilia, and that's my answer to that. Now, here's something that one of the leaders of the conservative movement had to say. Frankly, history is an ongoing rebuke to secular left-wing values. They can't afford to teach history because it would destroy the core vision of a hedonistic America in which there's no past and no future. That was said by Mr. Newt Gingrich, who has the longest entry in the book of anybody. It's close to 15 pages long. It's 3 or 4 times as long as anybody else in the book. It's headlined Gingrich Family Values. He has his own family values, special family values section. And here are some of the headlines in that section. Gingrich went to Congress by touting his role as a family man. 18 months later, divorced his wife, forced her to discuss details of the divorce in the hospital while recovering from cancer treatment. His wife had to say, he walked out in the spring of 1980. By September, I went in the hospital for my 3rd surgery. The 2 girls, their children, came up to see me, said, Daddy is downstairs. When he got there, he wanted to discuss the terms of the divorce while I was recovering from the surgery. Another headline, former campaign worker claims Gingrich said Jackie not pretty enough to be president's wife. Former campaign workers reported affairs during his first marriage. One of them said, regarding the first campaign he ran for Congress, which he lost, we would have won in 1974 if we could have kept him out of the office, screwing them on the desk. And here's a story. One day, one of his aides went to take some papers to him and found him in a car. His children were playing soccer nearby, and he had one of the soccer moms in the car, and this was the report. As I got to the car, and he had Newt's children with him, by the way, when he brought the papers. As I got to the car, I saw Newt in the passenger seat and one of the guy's wives with her head in his lap going up and down. Newt kind of turned and gave me his little boy smile. Fortunately, Jackie, Sue, and Kathy were a lot younger and shorter then. We have this in the book under the category little boy smile. We have the behavior with his wife under the categories hospital visit and ingratitude. Ingratitude because she put him through school and through his first campaign, and when he finally got elected, he dumped her. Married second wife 6 months after divorce was finalized, admitted to 6-year affair during second divorce. Third wife subpoenaed during second divorce trial, but claimed she could not testify because adultery illegal in D.C. admitted to extramarital affair during Lewinsky scandal, but said the situation was different because he did not lie under oath. So that's perhaps the foremost leader of the Republican Party on the congressional side in the recent era, who's, by the way, making a comeback now. The party is so bereft of people with any intelligence or talent now that he's making a comeback despite this kind of record. And he was one of the leaders of Clinton's impeachment. And he wasn't the only one who was a leader of that movement and involved in extramarital affairs. Bob Barr was, Henry Hyde, the Statute of Limitations fellow, Dan Burton, Helen Chenoweth, only one of the 2 women in our book. We only have 2 women out of the 110. But she was preaching against Clinton and against adultery and was having an affair back in Idaho, her home state. Bill Kristol, who's one of the intellectual leaders of this movement and edits one of their magazines, The Weekly Standard, said the following: Republicans have old-fashioned extramarital affairs with other adults. Those really are moral lapses that are private and more easily forgiven, and very different from taking advantage of a young person who works for you when you are president, meaning, again, Bill Clinton. So here's a few things that we have in the book about Republican adult behavior. Conservative commentator arrested for unlawful sexual activity with underage girls. Conservative talk show host convicted of exposing genitals to 11-year-old. Trinity Baptist Church pastor and values crusader arrested for sexual battery of children. State legislator and sponsor of tougher sex offender laws charged with raping foster daughters. Nominee of the NRCC, National Republican Campaign Committee, for Republican of the Year at the time he was nominated, was serving 26 years for sex crimes against children in jail. Creator of controversial anti-Gore commercial, convicted of sexual assault of child. Man who led crusade against gay adoption, supported by Republican officials, molests adopted daughter. Anti-abortion activist who posted a $1.5 million bounty for death of abortion doctors, sentenced for possession of child pornography. Trinity Baptist Church pastor and values crusader arrested for sexual battery of children. Congressman and vociferous gay rights opponent solicited sex from teenage gay nude dancer. Minister who condemned homosexuals sentenced to 10 years in prison for soliciting sex from a male teen. A conservative activist said this. His name is Nicholas Morency. Every day of my life, I pray for those who are the victims of sexual abuse. Here's a headline about him. Anti-abortion activist who I guess that was the same guy. That was the guy I read before. You remember Senator David Vitter, who was found consorting with prostitutes in Washington and in Louisiana. He said, I don't believe there's any issue more important than this one. He was referring to the constitutional amendment banning same-sex marriage. Mark Foley had said, we need to completely change the way we treat sex offenders. They are not petty criminals. This bill, which he was proposing, would make prey of predators who victimize our children. Robert Gray, a pastor, said this: the Bible says that people should love each other and show affection. He said that to a young girl whom he was sexually abusing. And here's my final one in this list. This is again a quote from Newt Gingrich. I think that the mother killing the 2 children in South Carolina vividly reminds every American how sick the society is getting and how much we need to change things. The only way you get change is to vote Republican. He was talking about Susan Smith there, who killed her 2 children. So here's a headline from the book. Chair of South Carolina Local Christian Coalition and State GOP Executive Committee member admits to sexually molesting his stepdaughter, convicted child killer Susan Smith. There's a list of 5 whom I call the Rogues Gallery. These are the ones that caused me to write the book. These all took place between 2005 and 2007. There was the Reverend Gary Aldridge, a top advisor to Jerry Falwell, who was found dead. He had asphyxiated himself, erotic asphyxiation, wearing 2 rubber wetsuits and flippers and gloves. Dr. David Hager, who was an advisor to the Bush administration on women's reproductive health, who was accused by his ex-wife of raping her anally, both when she was awake and when she was asleep, from narcolepsy and narcolepsy medicine. Neil Horsley, an anti-abortion crusader who admitted to, or bragged actually, about having sex with animals. Ted Hager, the evangelical leader who was found to have consorted with a male prostitute and taken methamphetamine with him. Finally, Mr. Larry Craig, the senator from Idaho, who provided the title for our book. He of the bathroom at the Minneapolis-St. Paul airport. The title of the book is You Don't Know Me, A Citizen's Guide to Republican Family Values. And when he denied that he was gay, the Idaho Statesman, his hometown newspaper, did a full-bore investigation, found 8 of his male lovers, and one of them said that after they had sex, he was rushing him out of the house as fast as he could, and he said to him, "Just remember, you don't know me, you haven't been here, you don't know who I am." That's where we took the title of the book. So there's an interpretive part of my book. It's in the introduction. I'm going to read you a few short quotes from some of the studies I bring to bear on the question of what this behavior is all about. I rely in the beginning on T.W. Adorno in his famous book, The Authoritarian Personality, written in 1950. Adorno was a refugee from Nazi Germany who I think was worried that the same thing might happen in the United States that happened in Weimar Germany. The right wing might come to power and institute a dictatorship. And he saw signs of that. I think he was a little bit paranoid, but he and his researchers tried to establish a link between repressed sexuality and right-wing politics. And here's a quote from him. "If the anti-democratic individual is disposed to see in the outer world impulses which are suppressed in himself, and we wish to know what those impulses are, then something may be learned by noting what he attributes most readily to others." And here's a list of questions to which his authoritarian subjects, those he identified that way, agreed. Homosexuality is a particularly rotten form of delinquency and ought to be severely punished. No matter how they act on the surface, men are interested in women for only one reason. The sex orgies of the old Greeks and Romans are nursery school stuff compared to some of the goings-on in this country today, even in circles where people least expect it. And sex crimes such as rape and attacks on children deserve more than imprisonment. Such criminals ought to be publicly whipped. That's interesting in view of the catalog that I just read and the percentage of pedophiles who are in my book. A strong inclination to punish violators of sex mores, homosexuals, sex offenders, may be an expression of a general punitive attitude, but it also suggests that the subject's own sexual desires are repressed and in danger of getting out of hand. I cite a study that's also actually cited in Dagmar's book on fascism, a study titled Is Homophobia Associated with Homosexual Arousal? And they showed 3 different kinds of pornography to a male audience. Some of them were homophobic, some of them weren't. And the homophobic men were stimulated by the male homosexual pornography, and the others weren't. There's a new expert in this field, sort of the successor to Adorno, named Bob Altamar. He's a professor in Canada, and he has studied people with what he calls a social dominance orientation. He distinguishes that from the people Adorno studied who were the followers of these movements. Adorno was studying who might follow them. Altomare was studying who would lead them. A personality with social dominance orientation is one characterized by traits of being hard, ruthless, and unfeeling towards others. And here are some of the questions he asked that those kinds of subjects agreed with. Do you enjoy having power to hurt people when they anger or disappoint you? If you have power in a situation, you should use it however you have to get your way. There really is no such thing as right and wrong. It all boils down to what you can get away with. And on the philosophical, in the philosophical plane, there's a philosopher named Leo Strauss, whom people in the neoconservative movement have been very fond of, who advocated rule by an elite, and one of his principles was the elite should con the masses into taking religion seriously and morality seriously, but they should be able to do anything they wanted themselves. And that, there's one more study I could cite, but I won't. I'll just mention it, that shows that you can identify conservatives and liberals when they're in kindergarten. And with that, I'll turn it over to Dagmar.
I wrote Sex in Crisis even though I'm actually a European historian who studied the Nazis and the ways they associated Jews with dirty, disgusting sex, and while promising their own followers clean and spectacular sex. And I didn't expect to be writing about the United States in the recent past at all. That doesn't sound right. But I grew up in the Bible Belt South, and in the 70s and 80s, and it was a beautiful, sensual place, and the evangelicals were much wilder than me. I had the strictest parents in the county, and I knew that evangelicalism did not need to be the way it was in the Bush years, and I wanted to understand how the religious right had managed to take over the terms of conversation so quickly, how suddenly liberals and Democrats had gotten so intimidated in the last 8 years on the Bush government that they couldn't defend sex outside of marriage anymore. They couldn't defend contraceptive rights or condoms in Africa or in the United States, the ways in which the Democrats had totally ceded the terms of conversation and gotten completely intimidated by the right-wing onslaught. I wanted to understand this puzzle. And so I tried to figure out how this happened over the last 10 to 15 years that the religious right had come to power, and how they used sex in order to, first of all, gain power in state legislatures, and also within all the evangelical denominations and mainstream Protestant denominations, and then ultimately take over the Congress and the White House. I mean, I really believe the religious right did the sex work for the Republican Party, and I wanted to understand how the Democrats let that happen. And there were basically three answers I came up with. One is that the religious right is not an anti-sex movement. It's wildly pro-sex with regard to marital sex. They promise amazing, multiply orgasmic pleasure for decades within marriage if you only follow their rules. So that was an important thing to understand. No repressive movement succeeds just by being sex negative. You have to promise your adherents pleasure. The second big message of my book is that the religious right succeeded by secularizing. The whole idea was very deliberate. In the middle of the 90s, there was a decision made at a big meeting of religious right leaders in Colorado in 1994 to make homophobia central to religious right activism. So they had their family values routine, they had their anti-abortion wrapped down, but there was a decision made that they're going to go after the minority of homosexuals. And there was a decision made explicitly to do that in secularized language, to pretend that they were fomenting a grassroots movement. We would now call this astroturfing. It's like creating fake grassroots. They're going to encourage people in hundreds of local communities across the United States to bully their local pastors, bully their local state legislators into being more openly homophobic. And the decision was made to do this in common sense terms, in secular terms. And the two big arguments used were, one, that homosexuals will go after your children because they, quote, can't breed, they need to recruit, and they're going to seduce your kids. And the other big argument made was that homosexual practices are disgusting, not what mom and dad do in the bedroom. The anus is an exit ramp, not an entry ramp. And this kind of stuff was very explicit and said all over the place, all over the country, in response to lesbian and gay efforts to do anti-discrimination legislation. The gay and lesbian movement had become much more visible, of course, in response to the scourge of HIV and AIDS. And so they were an easy target. This worked unbelievably well in the course of the 90s and has run aground more recently. As you know, thank goodness, homophobia is in measurable decline in the United States, and civil unions are increasingly acceptable to a majority of Americans. So, meanwhile, the focus has shifted to a renewed assault on women's reproductive rights and access to contraception for unmarried women, and to a generalized attack on sex outside of marriage, and a re-shaming and a re-policing also of marital sex. So, one of the big things that's happened is a secularization of the message, not just against homosexuals, but more recently also in abstinence education, they're not allowed to bring God into the public schools. So it's not about hellfire anymore, right? All the abstinence messaging is about low self-esteem. Repression has now been repackaged as promotion of mental health. In 2006, the Bush administration mandated that any curriculum that was taking federal funding, and at that point 46 of the 50 states took federal money, must communicate the information, and I put that in quotes, that sex outside of marriage can cause depression and suicide. The whole idea is that sex is dangerous outside of marriage. Only when it's within a meaningful, committed relationship is it okay. And I know that many states now, 25 states, have finally rejected federal abstinence money, but they are continuing to argue that they're going to promote abstinence first. And in these curricula, we're not just withholding information about condoms and contraceptives, we're actively lying to young people. Federal law, already under Clinton, this was attached to the welfare reform bill in '96. We are mandating that students be told, both in the abstinence-only curricula, which are taught in 1/3 of all public schools still, and also in the abstinence plus, which are abstinence-based but then include information on condoms and contraceptives, that sex outside of marriage is likely to have harmful psychological and physical effects. 95% of Americans have engaged in premarital sex, and in their hearts most know that it's made their marriages stronger. But this is not sayable in the public sphere. You will not find a Democratic politician who can say forthright, there's nothing wrong with sex outside of marriage. That's a sign of how much the terms of debate have been taken over. And the biggest thing I figured out, in addition to this promise of pleasure, and I want to tell you a little bit more about that, because one of the most depressing things I did in the last 2.5 years was read a lot of Christian sex advice manuals, is that they played on elemental fears. Everybody is afraid about the relationship between sex and love, about not being found desirable anymore, about not having pleasure as good as it could be. This is human to be worried about these things, and this is precisely what the religious right succeeded in playing on and why Democrats were caught off guard. This is especially true in the era of Viagra, which was discovered by accident in 1998, and was quickly followed then by a search for a pink Viagra for women, because that's a large market niche. And in addition, it has to do with the explosion of internet porn and the anxiety that something else is turning your partner on besides you. And religious right leaders have been unbelievably effective, again, in using secular messages. They're all about taking over the language of therapy speak and the promotion of mental health. So let me just give you a little bit of a glimmer of the information that the religious right is not sexually uptight. It's lasciviously explicit. It's explicit both about misery within marriage, the way too many wives feel like sperm depots for emotionally insensitive husbands, and it's explicit about the prospect of ecstasy. So you open all these sex advice books written by evangelicals in the last few years, and they'll say things like this. Some people have the mistaken notion that God is anti-sex. In fact, he's outspokenly pro-sex. He invented it. What an incredible thought. Passionate sex was God's idea. Or, another book, orgasm is an integral part of God's design for sex. And there is this very successful duo of two women who publish a lot of books and also do workshops all over the country, and they've coined the term soulgasm, which you'll all feel jealous about when you hear. But it is physiological, incredible orgasms, plus emotional connectedness with the partner, plus the presence of God in the bedroom. And not everybody wants that third part, but the first two parts sound fairly good to most people. And they have all these testimonials of women talking about what a soulgasm feels like. So these are the pleasures that await the evangelical wife, right? Quote, waves of pleasure flow over me. It feels like sliding down a mountain waterfall. Or, it's like having a million tiny pleasure balloons explode inside of me all at once. This literature is unbelievably explicit. You can get it in any Barnes & Noble. You can get it on the internet. There are Christian websites that give you very explicit advice on how to use a vibrator, how to spread the labia, don't make it too intense, do it like this. Any child can access this. These are the same websites that recommend S&M and bondage and spanking for heterosexuals, and also say that premarital sex is evil and that homosexual sex is not okay. So they're recommending anal sex for heterosexuals at the same time that even homosexual kissing is unacceptable. And there's also websites and if I'd been able to show pictures, I could have shown you, but you can go check it out for yourself, that sell Christian vibrators, Christian clit ticklers, Christian jelly rings, Christian, I don't know what to do with them because I'm too naive, and that pride themselves on marketing these without any pornographic images, because that would be offensive. So you can actually go to these websites like Book 22, which is the reference to the Song of Solomon, which is one of their favorite texts. There's entire books where you get walked through every verse of the Song of Solomon with tips for genital pleasuring in each stage. They've reinterpreted what it all means. Never mind that Solomon had lots of concubines. This is all a guide for how to be an amazing lover within marriage. The bottom line, of course, is that repression is not sufficiently appealing. But the other thing that happened is that in the wake of the discovery of Viagra and explosion of internet porn, there was tremendous anxiety about the relationship between the ability to perform and the actual experience of desire or intimacy, right? Is it the drug turning the man on, or is it the woman he's in bed with? Is it the fantasy swirling in somebody's head, or is it their partner? Do I even want my wife, or would I rather masturbate to the computer, or does she even want me? I mean, these were enormously difficult, emotionally painful questions. And since the year 2000, 3 million anti-masturbation guidebooks have been sold in the United States. That's a lot. They're not directed at teenage boys. They are directed at married men, and they are directed at them in the hope of redirecting their desire back to their wives. The way any one of you or me, if we touch a hot stove, would bounce our hand off. These books try to teach men how to bounce their eyes when they see a pretty woman, either in the lingerie ads in the Sunday paper or on the street. And they teach them how to avoid junk sex and focus on finding their wives sexually attractive again. This would all be just disgusting and bizarre if it weren't also even worse that these books are full of softcore pornographic scenarios. You know, some guy who just really needs to get it on with a teenage girl in his Bible study group that's then lasciviously described, or some woman who loves to watch quote-unquote lesbian scenes in porn because that really turns her on. That's how she has an orgasm when she's with her husband, and then it says that's bad and no, and you have to focus entirely on your husband. So they're simultaneously arousing, and then they douse, and they say, if you have any thoughts about anybody outside your partner, you will have miserable marriage sex for the rest of your life. It's a really weird combination of incitement and arousal, and then repression and punitive affect. These books are obsessed with the idea that wives should offer their husbands quickies, even when they're not in the mood themselves. They literally say, when your husband tells you that he's going cold turkey on porn, be like a merciful vial of methadone for him. Okay? I think that this is a sign. 3 million books. Some of these may be coerced sales in Bible study groups, but that's a lot of pain out there. And what I'm saying is that there are Christians out there who are exploiting other people's pain and making money off giving bad advice. This was all very successful because it happened in the midst of a national media spasm on the death of desire in America. So one of my biggest arguments, and I wish I could show you pictures on this, is 2001, 2, 3, the search for a female Viagra. Pharmaceutical companies got permission from the Food and Drug Administration to run drug trials for this drug that they can't find, because women's bodies are complicated, as are men's, but it's a little bit more complicated to figure out how to fix women's irritations with heterosexual sex. But they divided it up into lack of desire, lack of arousal, difficulty reaching orgasm, and dissatisfaction with inadequately intense orgasms, and that is a very large market niche. And the discussion around all of this led to a massive discussion about the idea of the death of desire. And it wasn't just women's desire that was declining. There was a real anxiety that post-marital sex was in shambles in the United States in general. And one of the contentions I make in the book is that this is the context in which people got so intimidated by being able to defend premarital sex. So the big thing is that the religious right then made the argument, again a secular one, that premarital chastity would make marital sex infinitely hotter. So they used people's discomfort with Victoria's Secret ads and internet porn and the hookup culture, the self-narcotizing that goes on college campuses in order to make an argument for premarital chastity. And then also, of course, with real consequences, which include denying condoms to people in Africa. Thanks very much. I guess two things in response to your very important, serious question. One is that I am a European historian. I spend a lot of time speaking with people who are serious sexology researchers in Europe and attending their conferences and learning from them. And in my work on the evolution of sexual politics in post-Nazi, post-fascist Germany and Europe, one thing I was really, really moved by and interested in was the long-term struggle to create really a politics of sexual justice. And the European Court of Human Rights takes this very seriously, that the right to self-determination and consent in sexual relationships are the most important moral values. Those are moral values, and they need to be defended. And it's not just the right to be free from sexual violence, abuse, or harassment. It is also the right to desired sexuality and the right to formation of intimate relationships. And you can take your country to court if you're denied those rights, and people do. And that extends to reproductive rights, to queer marriages, to transgender cases, to all kinds of things. And I think that's beautiful, and that took a long time, because the first reaction post-Nazism, because Nazism was in fact promiscuity encouraging for non-disabled heterosexual Aryans. So the first reaction was, oh, we need to restore Christian family values. So the fact that Christianity and anti-Semitism had been part of what made the Holocaust and Nazism possible was erased conveniently, and the restoration of Christian family values was presented as an anti-Nazi move. It took enormous struggle, and it was actually re-emigre Jews, including Adorno, who were central to that, who helped to liberalize post-war culture and say, no, a socially just post-fascist solution is to have sexual freedom, to protect people from violence, but also to encourage the right to desired sexuality and to defend that as a precious thing. Adorno was very clear about that, very courageous about that. Fritz Bauer, who was the main prosecutor in the Auschwitz perpetrator trials, also re-emigre Jew, also a gay rights activist, was hugely important in redirecting conversation, and the New Left student movement did a lot. So I think that I was very inspired by that alternative moral vision, and incredulous that it was not sayable in the United States, and incredulous by the constant intimidation that women who were older than me, who had been 68ers, right, that generation, the Make Love Not War crowd, 15 years older than me, who now had teenage daughters of their own, were like, oh, I don't want them to have premarital sex. And I just thought, didn't you? Why can't you see that some people really benefit from experimentation, and don't you want them to have some sense of self-ownership in their bodies? And what was it about our culture that people thought we were free because we were so surrounded by stimulus? And when in fact, of course, it's getting ever harder to get an abortion. It's getting ever harder to feel okay about not fitting into the mommy, daddy, baby mold. There was this new reshaming going on, and there seemed to be no alternative language of morality. So that was very motivating to me. The other thing was that I remembered full well. I grew up in the South in the 70s and 80s, and then I worked in the Midwest all through the 90s, and I taught history of sexuality, really 18th century to the present, very serious stuff, to my students. And they had been cheerful, proactive, open people, and they'd gotten totally intimidated. The students, by the end, within the 13, 14 years that I taught in the Midwest, I saw the shift. I saw the casualties of abstinence-only culture. I saw the intimidation of the girls. I saw the confusion of the boys, and it broke my heart. So that was a big motivation, too.
But even among liberal sets and liberal friends, there seems to be a kind of a conversational Nazism when it comes to discussing not if midget on donkey sites are wrong or right, but the kind of proliferation of increasingly bizarre, atmospheric, sexual sort of climates at this point, in my opinion. Like, not is it right or is it wrong, but it seems like even the discussion nowadays of what does it mean seems to be shut down a lot of the time, which I think in some ways is anti-intellectual, and maybe, if do either one of you, have you guys observed that, or maybe am I just kind of in a bubble?
Sex is private, despite all the publicity surrounding it. It's very intense for people, or at least the longing for it to be intense is intense for people. And it's very vulnerable making, and it's an incredibly easy way to manipulate people politically. So I think that we've been subjected to this unbelievable reshaming, where every bizarre desire, every banal, boring, bizarre desire is now scrutinized as somehow a sign of lack of health or normalcy. And everyone's made to feel weird all the time. And so, of course, the super weird stuff, people have no apparatus for talking about anymore. I think there's tremendous anxiety about whether you're going to continue to be desired by your lover or not, and what you're going to do about that, and whether it's okay to fantasize about other people. I mean, back in the 90s, everything was about reducing shame. And now everything is about reshaming and repolicing and re-examining and questioning. And, you know, you notice that the dating scene is no longer about great sex, it's about can you find a provider? You know, the whole thing is shutting down. And it's happening in a lot of different weird little subtle ways. And I think that when you asked me this question earlier about what motivated me to write the book, I gave you the answer. But what's happened since then, the last 5 months of being on the road all around the country and also here in liberal New York City, speaking with, you know, liberal leftist feminist types, I am so struck by people saying to me, one woman saying to me, I don't think sexuality is a very happy thing for many people, especially for women. This is like, you know, November 2008. And I said, yes, I think that's right, and that's why we're letting sexual rights erode. And so one of the big things I've come up with that I usually say is sex is imperfect, and that's what makes it wonderful and interesting, but we need to be able to defend it even when it's imperfect. And I think one of the things that's happened through this combination of conservatives being so graphically explicit and dangling this hope of amazing marital orgasms forever and ever, and on the other hand, Democrats getting all intimidated about their family values and whether they really still love each other or not, that combination has given us no space to talk about confused feelings, which everybody has.
In the 80s, I used to write about cults. I studied a cult in Oregon called the Rajneesh, and a psychotherapy cult and some other cults. And one of the things you find in cult studies is that every cult, and a cult defined as an organization that wants to take complete control of a group of people, not just some control, not just large control, but complete. One of the things they always make sure they do is get control of people's sexuality. You'll find this in every cult that ever existed. Some of them ban sexuality. Some of them encourage promiscuity, but in one way or another, they try and control it. You'll find this if you ever read or reread Helter Skelter about Charles Manson, who ran a cult in California, that he was very concerned with managing, supervising, manipulating his followers' sexuality. And what Dagmar said that reminded me of it, she said, well, if you can get, it was like the Catholic Church, if you can get control of people's sexuality, you can control them in every other way. And I think that's part of where this impulse comes from.
Some of this constant kind of puritanical overemphasis on kinky sex is a result of the fact that everybody's kind of numb at this point from hyperstimulation. Also, when you were talking about the way in which the right tries to exploit people's sexual desires to sell them on unhealthy practices or unhealthy attitudes, to recruit them and so on. I mean, I immediately thought of things like Cosmo, you know, or any number of TV commercials, which now routinely and brazenly eroticize things like new cars and shoes, you know. They also play on people's sexual desires. They also play on people's loneliness. But they do it in a way that doesn't seem theocratic and perverse and old-fashioned and puritanical. They do it in a way that's very up-to-date. Would you agree with that? And will you speak in the...
I mean, obviously, eroticizing cars has been going on for decades, right? That's not brand new.
It actually has become far more pronounced. I mean, not to be pedantic,
right,
but if you look at car ads from the 50s to the 70s, the car was always represented as a kind of means to an end. That is, a couple would get into a car and drive to some beautiful place where they presumably have a utopian experience. Now the driver is always alone with his car, and a woman will often be running her hand lovingly over the car's surface. So the car itself is actually a sex object. That's fairly recent.
I don't know. I remember jokes in high school about women who were worried that the guys were more into their cars than they were into the women.
Well,
I mean, there was a kind of, it's not a homoerotic charge, but it's like a men amongst themselves kind of thing, right, where cars are more interesting and women are just irritating.
But you don't.
Separate, let's not argue about the car thing.
It's not just cars, it's commodities.
Right. I mean, Europe is really interesting, right? Because they've been commenting on the death of desire across the West since the 90s. The news media spasm only hit the U.S. in the 2002-03. That's when sort of What to Do When His Sex Drive Takes a Nosedive hit Cosmo also. And I think Europeans are much more interested in exactly how the overstim makes everybody be unaroused. And the response to that is not only to say, oh, well, people need now midget on donkey or something ever more intense, but I actually think that the really interesting conversation is that love has come back into the conversation. And that, yes, the most physically intense orgasm can still leave you feeling utterly empty inside. And that's a really interesting human phenomenon, that the yearning for romance and explosive emotional intensity persists, despite all efforts to pimp it, to eulogize it, to market it, to do all that kind of other stuff. It doesn't go away. The human desire for passionate intensity doesn't go away, and that's actually a hugely comforting thing to me. But it also worries me a great deal that that's where the conservatives are finding the voice to speak and trying to offer pseudo-solutions. And progressives are not able to celebrate human diversity, talk about the complexity of desire and the unruliness of that, and actually not make people feel crappy when they can't find that, but also not worry so much that it's going to disappear. And I think what's happening now, if you look at all the other books that are out there on religion and sex, what I notice is that the debate, that there's hookup. Fascism is a constant presence in any thoughtful European conversation about sexuality or sexual politics, right? They're so aware of that in their background because that's their touchstone for how they figured out how to have a different way of morality. I mean, the trauma in our country is slavery, right? Utterly sexualized, utterly horrific, torturous system. We haven't processed it. The world didn't force us to process it. The world forced the Germans to process what they did. So one of the dramas in this country is that we haven't come to terms with that. But I would say, yes, one of the weird things that goes on in the conversations in Europe is how can it be, under the Bush administration, right, that torture is considered moral, but teen sex is immoral? How did that happen? That's mind-blowing for Europeans because they had a fight where they said, no, you know, nudity and free love, that's not immoral. Auschwitz is immoral. So murder, racism, Vietnam War, that was that generation. They looked like, this is outrageous. What's wrong with sex? But the Americans made that connection for a while, but didn't have the same moral intensity to it that anybody living in post-fascist Europe did. And so what happens now in the discussions around sex trafficking and the UN troops and the raping and the sexual violence in Abu Ghraib and all those kinds of discussions is that the most thoughtful Europeans say we cannot have repressive sexual morality as the response to this violence. We need to go to a system where we defend the right to desired sexuality and the right to protection from sexual violence. We have to go to the individual. And individuals have the right to be different. They don't all have to fit into the happy little mommy-daddy package. And that's the difference in the conversation, right? So too often in the United States, and even Obama has made this mistake, they lump together prostitution and sex trafficking, right? When what you should do is lump trafficking together with slavery. Prostitution is a consensual exchange. We can talk about the coercive conditions of poverty and lack of options and so on, but basically one should make distinctions between voluntary prostitution and trafficking, but too often, and literally American law does not make that distinction, right? The PEPFAR program that Bush just got reauthorized in 2008 forces every NGO that takes American money through USAID to sign a pledge that is not only opposed to trafficking but also to prostitution.
How do you tell the difference? It's all very vague and blurry. I mean,
it's not that vague and blurry.
Is prostitution really consensual?
Yes. Yes, I think I urge you to read a book called Temporarily Yours, which is one of the best recent studies. It's by Elizabeth Bernstein.
That's a very controversial position you're taking.
I do. But you know what? That's what happens when you study history. You learn that obviously all through the 20th century, many people who are married feel like they're selling sexual services for economic security. So that's a blurry line too. And the only way people have figured out to try to distinguish, and honestly, the Christian sex advice that I read is testimony enough to the amount of emotional wasteland and lack of mutuality that also exists within marriage. So yeah, I think that it's a controversial position, but it's one that has found its form and its expression in the European Court of Human Rights, and they've thought it out fairly well.
The fact that the Democrats have this reputation for being the party of wanton self-indulgence, and that the Republicans, I think, to some extent, still have a reputation for being the party of sexual restraint, despite the evidence to the contrary, has a great deal to do with the media. Because the media has, willingly amplified the Republicans' constant attacks on Democrats for their loose living and the culture of permissiveness and that kind of thing.